We're taught that power belongs to kings, presidents, and generals, to the people whose names fill textbooks and statues. But history isn't shaped only by the people who we remember. It's shaped just as often by people who never ruled, never led armies, and sometimes never even realized the power they were holding. These are 25 people you've probably never heard of, but without them, the world you live in would look completely different. Number 1. Jakob Fugger. Power through money. In the early 1500s, Europe was ruled by emperors, popes, and kings, but behind them stood one man who financed all of them. Jakob Fugger was a German banker based in Augsburg, and by the time he died, he controlled more wealth than any private individual in Europe. Fugger didn't just lend money, he decided who received it. And when the position of Holy Roman Emperor became vacant, multiple royal families competed for the crown. The title came with immense power, as you can imagine, control over much of Central Europe. But the election was expensive. Bribes had to be paid, alliances bought, and votes secured. The man who became emperor, Charles V, did so because Jakob Fugger funded his campaign. Fugger didn't sit on a throne, but without his money, no one else could. Power didn't wear a crown. It sat in Jakob Fugger's bank ledger. Number 2. Virginia Hall. Power through persistence and invisibility. History rarely remembers spies' names, and almost never the ones who changed the course of a war. Virginia Hall was an American woman operating behind enemy lines in Nazi-occupied Europe during World War II. She had no army, no rank, no official protection. No one really knew about what she was doing. She also had a prosthetic leg. After losing her leg in an accident years earlier, Hall was told her intelligence career was over. So she ignored them. And in France, Hall built resistance networks, coordinated sabotage, arranged weapons drops, and helped Allied pilots escape occupied territory. The Gestapo hunted her relentlessly. They called her the most dangerous of all Allied spies. And when the Nazis closed in, Hall escaped over the Pyrenees on foot, on a prosthetic leg, in winter. She returned anyway, again and again. By the time Allied forces landed in Europe, the networks Hall helped build were already in place, disrupting railways, communications, and supply lines. Power didn't come from her authority, it came from her persistence, from refusing to disappear, and from operating so effectively that the enemy knew her name, but never saw her coming. Number 3. Edward Bernays. Power through perception. Edward Bernays didn't command armies, he commanded attention. Born in Austria and raised in the United States, Bernays was the nephew of the one and only Sigmund Freud. He believed human behavior was driven not by logic, but by unconscious desires. And if you could shape those desires, well, you could shape society. Bernays worked for corporations and governments. He convinced women to smoke by branding cigarettes as symbols of freedom. He helped companies turn ordinary products into social necessities. He advised governments on how to manufacture public consent. Bernays didn't force people to believe anything. He made them want to. Modern advertising, political messaging, and public relations all trace back to his methods. If you can shape what people believe is normal, you don't need force at all. Number 4. Stanislav Petrov. Power through restraint. On September 26, 1983, during the height of the Cold War, Stanislav Petrov was on duty at a Soviet early warning base. Shortly after midnight, the system alerted him. US nuclear missiles had been launched. Protocol was clear. He was supposed to report the attack immediately. That report could have triggered a nuclear response. So Petrov hesitated. He noticed inconsistencies. The system reported only a small number of missiles. It just didn't make strategic sense. So Petrov made a decision that went against training, protocol, and expectation. He reported it as a false alarm. The alert was wrong. No missiles had been launched. Petrov never fired a weapon, never gave an order, but by choosing not to act, he may have prevented nuclear war. Sometimes the greatest power is knowing when not to use it. Number 5. Jean Monnet, power through systems. Jean Monnet believed wars were not caused by people. They were caused by systems that made conflict inevitable. After 2 world wars that had devastated Europe, Monnet helped design a new structure. Instead of focusing on borders or leaders, he focused on resources, coal and steel, the materials needed for war. They would be shared across nations. France and Germany, historic enemies, would become economically interdependent. Monnet never held an elected office. He worked behind the scenes, drafting frameworks, negotiating quietly, and building institutions. Those ideas became the foundation of the European Union. So power didn't come from speeches or armies. It came from designing a system where war no longer made sense. And that is power that's still intact today. Number 6. Maurice Hankey, power through bureaucracy. Maurice Hankey never commanded troops. He never appeared on propaganda posters. Most people have never heard his name. Yet, for more than 20 years, Hankey sat at the centre of British power. Based in London, Hankey served as secretary to Britain's highest war councils during both World War I and World War II. Prime ministers came and went, generals argued and came and went, cabinets collapsed. Hankey stayed. He controlled the flow of information. He decided which reports reached leaders and which didn't. He shaped agendas, coordinated intelligence, and ensured decisions were carried out across government departments. In modern terms, Hankey wasn't a politician. He was the operating system. Wars weren't just fought on battlefields. They were fought in meeting rooms, in politician rooms, and Hankey was always in the room. Power doesn't always belong to the person making the speech. Sometimes it belongs to the person deciding what the speaker knows. Number 7. Francis Perkins, power through policy. When Franklin D. Roosevelt became president in 1933, the United States was collapsing. Banks were failing, unemployment was soaring, and workers had no safety net. Francis Perkins, born in Boston and educated at Mount Holyoke and Columbia, was appointed Secretary of Labor, the first woman ever to serve in a U.S. presidential cabinet. But Perkins' power didn't come from symbolism. She helped design Social Security, minimum wage laws, unemployment insurance, and workplace safety standards. These weren't speeches, they were systems. Perkins understood something most leaders didn't. If you change the rules people live under, you change society itself. Millions of Americans would eventually rely on programs she helped create, and often without ever knowing her name. So power didn't come from popularity, it came from her permanence. Number 8. Hjalmar Schacht, power through economics. In the 1920s, Germany was in chaos after World War I. Hyperinflation had destroyed savings, money was nearly worthless, the reparations, the country was politically unstable. Well, Hjalmar Schacht was a German economist and banker, and then he stepped in. As president of the Reichsbank, Schacht stabilized the German currency and helped engineer an economic recovery that restored confidence and employment. Later, under the Nazi regime, Schacht devised financial mechanisms that allowed Germany to rearm in secret, bypassing international restrictions. He didn't design tanks, he didn't command armies, but without Schacht's financial strategies, Germany could not have rebuilt its military. Schacht proved that war doesn't begin with weapons or an army. It begins with balance sheets. Power doesn't always pull the trigger. Sometimes it just signs the check. Number 9. Gertrude Bell, power through administration. Gertrude Bell never held elected office. She never commanded troops, but she did help design an entire region of the modern world. Bell was a British archaeologist, linguist, and intelligence officer operating in the Middle East during and after World War I. She spoke Arabic fluently, she knew tribal leaders personally, and understood the region better than most of the men officially that were in charge. And so when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Britain faced a problem. What comes next? Well, Bell was brought into the administration of Mesopotamia, what would soon become Iraq. She advised British officials on borders, leadership, and governance. She helped select Faisal I as king. She influenced how tribes grouped, which factions were empowered, and how authority would function. These weren't academic choices. They became the foundation of a nation. Bell didn't rule Iraq, but she helped decide how it would be ruled. And the borders she influenced and the compromises she helped shape still echo through the region today. Power didn't come from speeches or uniforms, it came from knowledge, access, and being in the room when decisions were made. And Gertrude Bell was always in the room. Number 10. Girolamo Savonarola. Power through belief. In the late 1400s, Florence, Italy, was one of the most powerful cities in Europe. It was wealthy, it was artistic, and ruled by elite families. Savonarola was a Dominican monk. He had no army, no political office, no money. But what he did have was immense belief. And from the pulpit, Savonarola preached that Florence was corrupt and doomed unless it purified itself. His sermons drew massive crowds. His words stirred fear, guilt, and devotion. Soon, citizens were burning books, art, and luxury goods in what became known as the bonfire of the vanities. For a brief moment, Savonarola effectively controlled Florence, not through law or force, but through moral authority. Belief reshaped behavior. Behavior reshaped power. Savonarola eventually fell, but the lesson remained. If you can control what people believe is righteous, you can control what they're willing to destroy. And that is power. Number 11. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Power through ideas. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was a French Jesuit priest, philosopher, and paleontologist. He lived in the early 20th century and spent much of his life working quietly, often in isolation, because many of his ideas were considered too radical for the church at the time. Teilhard believed that human consciousness was evolving, not just biologically, but spiritually and intellectually. He argued that humanity was moving toward a shared collective awareness, something he called the Omega Point. At the time, these ideas were suppressed. His writings were banned from publication while he was alive. But after his death, his work spread. Teilhard's thinking quietly influenced modern psychology, systems theories, and environmental thought, and even the early language used by technologists describing the internet and, yes, artificial intelligence. He never built a machine, he never led a movement, but he changed how people thought about humanity's future. Power doesn't always reshape the world immediately. Sometimes it waits for the world to catch up. Number 12. Madame Chiang Kai-shek, also known as Soong Mei-ling. Power through funding and access. Madame Chiang Kai-shek never commanded an army, but she helped decide which ones were supplied. Born Soong Mei-ling, she was educated in the United States and fluent in English at a time when few Chinese leaders were. She married Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the nationalist China. But her power came from something else entirely: access. Because during World War II, China was desperate for international support. Japan controlled vast territory, resources were scarce, and survival depended on foreign aid. Madame Chiang became China's most effective diplomat. She traveled to the United States, met directly with the president, which was Franklin D. Roosevelt, and addressed the United States Congress, something no Chinese leader had ever done. She framed China's war as America's war. She shaped public opinion. She unlocked funding, weapons, and political backing. Billions in aid followed. Without that support, China's resistance against Japan would have collapsed far earlier, fundamentally altering the balance of power in Asia. Madame Chiang didn't write policy. She didn't sign treaties, but she opened the doors where money, weapons, and legitimacy flowed. Power didn't come from ideology. It came from persuasion, proximity, and knowing exactly who to speak to. 13. Abu Musab al-Suri. Power through strategy. Abu Musab al-Suri was not a charismatic leader. He didn't command a large force or hold territory. What made him powerful was thought. Al-Suri was a strategist who believed centralized organizations were weak. Leaders could be targeted, hierarchies could be destroyed. His solution was decentralization. He wrote extensively about creating movements without leaders, networks of small, independent cells connected only by ideology. These ideas influence how modern extremist movements operate, making them harder to be dismantled and easier to regenerate. Al-Suri rarely appeared in public. Few people recognized his face, but his ideas reshaped conflict in the modern world. Power doesn't always sit at the top. Sometimes it spreads so thin it becomes impossible to remove. Number 14. Vasily Arkhipov. Power through refusal. In October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis pushed the world to the edge of nuclear war. A Soviet submarine deep underwater believed it was under attack by US forces. Communication with Moscow had been cut. The submarine carried a nuclear torpedo. To launch it, approval was required from 3 officers. 2 had already agreed. The third was Vasily, and Arkhipov refused. He argued that they had no confirmation of war and that launching would guarantee catastrophe. His refusal prevented a nuclear strike that could have triggered a global war. Arkhipov didn't save the world with a speech, he saved it by saying no. Sometimes power isn't found in authority, it's found in dissent. Number 15. Anna Rosenberg. Power through presence. Anna Rosenberg never commanded troops, she never led a government department, but during World War II, she was everywhere power was being exercised. She was born in Hungary and raised in New York. Rosenberg became one of Franklin D. Roosevelt's most trusted advisors on labor and manpower. At a time when the United States was trying to mobilize an entire economy for war, factories and unions, industry leaders and military planners, they didn't agree with each other. And so Rosenberg was sent in anyway. She moved between boardrooms, war councils, and union halls. She was negotiating compromises that kept production running and prevented massive labor unrest. When generals complained they couldn't get equipment fast enough, well, Rosenberg was there. When industry leaders resisted change, Rosenberg was there. When political pressure threatened to stall the war effort, she was there again. Her job wasn't to make speeches, it was to make the system work. Later, she became the first woman to serve as U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense, overseeing manpower at the height of the Cold War. Rosenberg didn't shape history with commands. She shaped it by standing inside the machinery of power and keeping it moving. But power doesn't always come from issuing orders. Sometimes it comes from being the person everyone turns to when things are about to break. Number 16. Clair, Cameron, Patterson. Power through science. In the mid-20th century, lead was everywhere. It was in gasoline, it was in paint, it was in the water pipes, it was in the air people breathed every day. Well, Clair Cameron Patterson was an American geochemist working in California at the time. He wasn't trying to change the world, he was trying to determine the age of the Earth. But his research kept running into a problem. Lead contamination was so widespread that it was corrupting every sample he touched. Instead of ignoring it, Patterson followed the evidence, followed the science. What he discovered was alarming. Industrial lead pollution had massively increased lead levels in the human body, especially in children. The health effects were severe: cognitive damage, developmental problems, and long-term harm. Industry pushed back, and it pushed back hard. Patterson was attacked, discredited, and pressured to stop, but he didn't. His work eventually led to the removal of lead from gasoline worldwide, preventing untold damage to global public health. He never held office, he never passed a law, but his refusal to stay quiet reshaped the environment and the entire planet as we know it. Power doesn't always enforce silence. Sometimes it breaks it with the power of science. Number 17, Jan Karski, Power Through Truth Ignored. Jan Karski was a Polish resistance courier during World War II. His job was to carry information from occupied Europe to the Allied leadership. In 1942, Karski was smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto and later into Nazi transit camps, so he could see firsthand what was happening to Europe's Jews and how bad it was. What he witnessed was horrifying. It couldn't explain it. But Karski memorized details, numbers, descriptions, evidence, all in his brain. He traveled across Europe and met with Allied leaders, including British officials and US President Franklin D. Roosevelt at the time. He told them what was happening and how bad it was. And he was not believed. Or worse, he was believed, but nothing changed. Karski had the truth, and it was brutal, but the truth alone was not enough to move power. Sometimes the most devastating power is not what is done, but what is ignored. 18. Sophie Scholl, Power Through Moral Courage. Sophie Scholl was a university student in Nazi Germany. She wasn't a soldier, she wasn't a politician, she was no one special. She was part of a small resistance group called the White Rose. They wrote and distributed pamphlets condemning the Nazi regime and urging Germans to resist from the inside. No weapons, no violence, just words. In 1943, Sophie was caught distributing leaflets at the University of Munich. She was arrested, tried, and executed days later. Her actions did not stop the war. They did not topple the regime. But her words survived. Today, Sophie Scholl is remembered as a symbol of moral resistance, proof that power can exist even when the odds guarantee defeat. Power doesn't always win. Sometimes it simply refuses to surrender, and surrender its conscience. Number 19, Mikhail Gorbachev's Advisors, Power Through Restraint. When the Soviet Union began to collapse in the late 1980s, the world expected violence. Previous empires had fallen through war or repression and bloodshed. This one didn't, because behind the scenes, a group of advisors around Mikhail Gorbachev made a series of decisions that went against decades of precedent. They chose not to use force. They chose negotiation over repression. They chose restraint. They allowed Eastern Europe to break away. They accepted the fall of the Berlin Wall. They resisted the urge to hold the system together through violence. These advisors are rarely named. They don't appear in history books, but their decisions ended a superpower without a global war. Sometimes the greatest power is knowing when to let go. Number 20, Paul von Hindenburg's Inner Circle, Power Through Legality. By the early 1930s, Germany was fragile. Economic collapse, political extremism, public fear, all of it. Paul von Hindenburg was Germany's president, a respected war hero nearing the end of his life. Around him was a group of advisors and political elites who believed they could control a rising figure named Adolf Hitler. They thought they could use him, contain him, manage him. They advised Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as Chancellor, legally, constitutionally, and within the system. They were wrong. That single decision transferred power without a coup, without a revolution, and without immediate violence. The most catastrophic regime in history entered through the front door. Power doesn't always overthrow systems. Sometimes it exploits them. Number 21, Alan Dulles, Power Through Networks. Alan Dulles is remembered as the first civilian director of the CIA, but his real power began long before that. In the 1930s and 40s, Dulles worked as a lawyer and intelligence operative, moving between Wall Street, European banks, diplomats, and spies. He didn't just gather information, he built relationships. While officially neutral, he maintained quiet contact with German industrialists, resistance figures, and political elites. He understood something critical. Information is most powerful when it moves through trusted networks, not official channels. By the time the CIA was created, Dulles wasn't just qualified, he was inevitable. He didn't rise because he was appointed, he rose because he already knew everybody. Power doesn't always come from institutions. Sometimes institutions are built around power that already exists. Number 22, Meyer Amschel Rothschild, Power Through Systems. Meyer Amschel Rothschild was born in Frankfurt in the mid-1700s. He wasn't noble, he didn't command armies, he didn't rule territory. What he built was something far more durable. Rothschild created a financial network across Europe, using his sons as partners in different capitals. Money, information, and influence could move faster through his family than through governments. So during wars and revolutions, when states collapsed or borders shifted, Rothschild's system endured. He understood that centralized power was fragile. Distributed systems survived, and modern global finance still operates on principles he pioneered. Power doesn't always seek control. Sometimes it seeks resilience. Number 23, Claus von Stauffenberg, Power Through Defiance. Von Stauffenberg was a German army officer during World War II. By 1944, he believed Germany was being destroyed from within, and that Hitler had to be stopped. Stauffenberg didn't act alone, but he chose to act. He placed a bomb during a meeting intended to kill Hitler. The attempt failed. Stauffenberg was executed the same day. His action did not end the war. It did not remove the regime, but it shattered the illusion of total loyalty inside Nazi Germany. After the attempt, Hitler turned inward, tightening control and accelerating purges. Trust eroded and fear intensified. A failed act still reshaped the internal balance of power, because sometimes power lies not in success, but in exposing fragility. Number 24, the Sykes-Picot Signatories, Power Through Lines on a Map. In 1916, as World War I raged, two men met in secret, Mark Sykes of Britain and Francois-Georges Picot of France. They drew lines across a map of the Middle East. Those lines ignored history, culture, religion, and identity. They were designed to serve imperial interests, not people. When the war ended, those borders became real. Nations were created, conflicts were embedded, instability became structural. Most people have never heard the names Sykes or Picot, but the consequences of their agreement are still felt today. Power doesn't always arrive with armies. Sometimes it arrives with a pen on a map. Number 25, Vasily Grossman, Power Through Truth. Vasily Grossman was a Soviet journalist and writer during World War II. He witnessed some of the worst atrocities of the war firsthand. He documented them honestly, and that honesty made him dangerous. Grossman believed that truth itself was a form of power, one that outlived regimes and propaganda. His writings challenged both Nazi brutality and Soviet repression. The Soviet state suppressed his work, naturally. His manuscripts were confiscated and his words were silenced, but they survived. Decades later, Grossman's writing reshaped how the world understood war, totalitarianism, and human dignity. He never commanded soldiers, he never passed laws, but his words outlasted the system that tried to erase them. Power doesn't always win immediately. Sometimes it waits. So that's the end of the list, and I hope you know that power doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always wear uniforms, hold office, or seek recognition. History is shaped by people who act, by people who refuse, by people who fund ideas, and by people who never realize the power they're holding at all. And often the most powerful forces in history are the ones no one sees coming. But what you really need to know is that everybody has power inside of them, and everybody is capable of choosing power for good.